The world is filled with countless dangers hidden around every corner. One of the most frightening scenarios for a lot of us are, whether lost in the wild or interacting with exotic pets, is finding ourselves in the jaws of a snake. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. These are the most insane snake attacks you'll ever hear. Welcome to Final Affliction.
Jara was a 54-year-old grandmother. She lived with her family in the village of Bitten on the Indonesian island of Sumatra. On the 21st of October 2022, she said goodbye to her family and headed off to work for the day. Jara worked in the rubber plantations for decades. Her hours were long and arduous, working through the scorching midday sun. Her job was a trapper. This involved using a knife to cut diagonal lines in the rubber tree bark. Milky white liquid would drip from the cuts she made, which she collected in small plastic cups or coconut shells. The plantation was huge. Row upon row of rubber trees stood as far as the eye could see. Since the year 2000, Indonesia has lost 18% of its tree cover. Deforestation clears ground for agriculture. In the Jambi province where Jara worked in the southeast of the island, rice, corn, tobacco, palm oil, and rubber were produced on a massive scale. The plantations are surrounded by beautiful countryside. In Jambi, the Barisan Mountains and volcanic peaks protrude from the evergreen forests. The lush green valleys are filled with tidal rivers and scattered with mangrove swamps. This habitat is home to a plethora of native wildlife, all of which is competing with an ever-expanding human population. Jara left her home before dawn. The world outside her little house was dark. Only the moon provided a sliver of light for her to see her way through the dense jungle and towards the plantation. Jara earned the equivalent of £1.25 a day. With an extra job on the side and working 7 days a week, Jara managed a monthly salary of just £45 or $55. There was no job security at the plantation. Despite having worked there for over a decade, Jara, like many other workers, was still only employed on a day labor basis and had no formal contract or benefits that would go with that. After Jara had signed in at the plantation that morning, she set to work. She held her knife tight against each tree and made the diagonal incisions. She was focused on the job at hand, waiting until the milky white rubber began flowing before tying her collection beaker underneath it and moving on to the next tree. She didn't hear a stealthy predator approaching her, but suddenly she felt an incredible pain on her back. It was a sharp stabbing pain that made her jump forwards. She dropped her knife in the commotion and felt something wrapped tightly around her body. To her utter horror, a 22-foot-long snake had wrapped itself around Jara's body. Its thick, muscular coil squeezed tighter and ever tighter. Jara gasped as she was pulled to the ground. She took a deep breath as the pressure built around her body. She couldn't move. Her arms were pinned down by her side. The giant snake had taken her completely by surprise. It had ambushed her in the dawn light. She stood no chance of fighting back. The more she wriggled to free herself, the more the snake tightened its suffocating grip. She desperately tried to wriggle free. Her sandals came off her feet as she tried to kick the snake. Her headscarf fell from her head and landed silently to the ground. Jara felt her lungs about to burst. The snake was squeezing so tightly that she couldn't exhale. In a few agonizing minutes, Jara was dead. It was a tragedy. She died alone with no one aware of the horror she was suffering. She had worked every day of her adult life to provide for her family, and they were unlikely to receive any form of compensation for their devastating loss. When Jara no longer struggled, when her body lay still and her heart stopped beating, the snake released its grip. It uncoiled itself from around Jara and slithered towards her head. With its unblinking eyes, it stretched the elastic ligaments holding its lower jaw to its skull, and its mouth opened wide, wider than its own head, wider than Jara's head. Then it started consuming her. Inching its mouth over her body, it enveloped the young grandmother, swallowing her further and further down, working its way over her head, over her shoulders, and down towards her feet. During the course of the day, the snake became severely engorged as it managed to fit Jara's entire body inside its stomach. Reticulated pythons are the longest snakes in the world. They typically range from 1.5 meters in length to 6.5 meters, approximately 5 to 25 feet. But reports of them exceeding these lengths, such as the one that killed Jara, are common. They can weigh as much as 75 kilograms or 165 pounds. At the end of the day, when Jara didn't return home, her husband became worried. He went out searching for her. He followed the usual path she took through the undergrowth to the rubber plantation. She hadn't checked out of work that day. Her husband scouted the plantation, walking down the long rows of trees and calling out her name. Then he came across Jara's jacket on the ground. Next to it lay her sandals and knife. He picked them up and looked around. He called out again, but the silence was deafening. He knew something terrible must have happened to her. He ran back to the village and called for people to help him search. A group followed him to the rubber plantation. As darkness fell, they continued to look for Jara. It was only at 2 a.m. that Jara's husband reluctantly gave up searching for the night and returned home. He reported his wife missing to the local police the next day. They, along with security officials, joined in the search. He took them to the spot where he found Jara's belongings lying on the ground. The search continued. Reports suggested that it wasn't until 2 days later that one of the locals made a shocking discovery. An enormous 7-meter-long snake was laying in the grass. It could barely move. Its body was grossly bulging. One of the locals severed its head, killing it there and then. They dragged it into a clearing. A crowd gathered around. Under the order of Police Chief Harifa, someone took out another knife and ran it along the length of the snake's body, cutting it from head to tail. As the snake opened up, Jara's body spilled out onto the ground. She was completely intact. It was a terrifying shock for the onlookers. Something that would haunt her family for the rest of their days. To know that a loved one had been completely consumed by a giant snake was the stuff of nightmares. A spokesman for the village from where Jara lived said that recently some of the villagers had spotted an even bigger python in the area. They estimated that it was at least 27 feet long and had tried to capture it, but it managed to get away. It slithered off into the surrounding forest. Naturally, the locals are concerned that there are such huge snakes living in the forests around their homes. But attacks like this are becoming increasingly common. Although in the grand scheme of things they are a rare occurrence, they are happening more often than before. The reticulated pythons can grow to enormous lengths, but their typical prey is usually much smaller than a human. Often, they prey on pigs and deer or rodents around nesting birds. But with their habitat in sharp decline, they have nowhere to go. They are in direct competition with humans for some of their food sources too. And as their habitat becomes more and more fragmented, they sometimes need to pass through civilization to make their way from one forested area to the next. Human settlements also offer enticing food for these snakes. Rats and domesticated livestock are always within close proximity to people. And whilst humans wouldn't normally be on the menu, the snake's opportunistic nature makes them a formidable predator, though one we should respect, because if we don't, we may just meet our terrifying final affliction.
Jamie Coots was a controversial character to say the least. By 2012, his outrageous church services had even been showcased on the National Geographic Channel. Coots liked to bring live snakes on stage, his favorite being the rattlesnakes and vipers. The more venomous, the better. He and his congregation believed that his 20 years of handling the snakes, while being bitten no less than 8 times, was proof of God's divine intervention. It was evidence that true believers could always count on God for protection from even the most dangerous creatures and circumstances. But Coots was, well, a kook, and it's hard to have much sympathy for a man who put his own congregation in danger. It would have been one thing if he'd taken all the risk upon himself, but Coots allowed his church members to handle the snakes themselves, telling them that faith would keep them safe. It worked out pretty well for Coots for a while. That's until 28-year-old Melinda Brown died after being bitten by a 1.2-meter-long rattlesnake in 1995. Melinda was taken to Coots' home, where she suffered for 2 days before she died from the bite, and no one called for help until it was too late. Preaching about love and bravery is one thing, but if you're going to go out of your way to test your God, no matter who you're praying to, you're poking the bear. Putting innocent people in the line of fire is absolutely unacceptable. He never bothered to get licensed to carry or keep the reptiles, since no authoritative body would have ever allowed anyone to handle venomous snakes on a stage and with such close contact with the general public. He had a pretty long rap sheet because authorities kept catching him with tanks full of unregistered snakes in his car. It's a little mind-boggling why he was allowed to get away with it for so long, despite operating so openly. Somehow, Coots continued to operate his charlatan church for another 19 years before disaster struck again. But this time, it was Coots himself who suffered the consequences. In the middle of a Saturday morning service, Coots was holding a handful of rattlesnakes when he dropped them onto the stage. This wasn't an accident. He often went out of his way to aggravate the serpents, to show just how far he could take things without fear. Coots picked them up again, and that's when one of the understandably angry snakes bit him. Since he'd been bitten before and never had any adverse reactions, no one blinked an eye. According to another preacher, Cody Wynn, Coots stepped off the stage just a few minutes later to go to the bathroom, but he returned after a few moments and continued the service as if nothing had happened. Now, you might be wondering how Coots could have survived 8 previous bites before. Well, this isn't actually all that uncommon. Snake charmers in India get bitten all the time by the deadly cobras that they handle. The reason is quite simple. It's not possible to tame or train reptiles, but they are perfectly aware that the human that owns them keeps them fed, comfortable, and warm. So even though they don't feel any affection toward them, they don't exactly see them as a threat. The snakes intentionally don't excrete venom when they sink their fangs into their handlers, using the bites only as a warning that they're getting annoyed, never intending to actually kill the people who handle them. But it doesn't take much to push the naturally feral creatures over the edge. Even something as simple as a temperature change is enough to get them aggressive enough to exact the full potential of their venom into the people foolish enough to parade them around like show dogs. Coots was doing everything possible to get the snakes as angry as he could, so the only miracle here is that it took more than 20 years before he got on the wrong side of a rattler who wasn't going to stand the TV star's antics anymore. The other preachers and band members expressed their concern, because Coots was already becoming pale and perspiring profusely before he left. It was quite obvious that the man was in the beginning stages of a severe reaction. They even called 911, but Coots told them that he was just going to go home and lie on his couch and pray like he always did. By the time the paramedics arrived, Coots was already gone. He'd simply gotten into his car and drove himself home before they got there. The paramedics did their due diligence and contacted Coots at his residence. Over the phone, he refused medical treatment and told them that he was doing fine. But the professionals noticed that Coots' speech was slurred and that he sounded faint, so they got into the ambulance and tracked down his address. But it was too late. They found Coots on his couch, unresponsive. They performed CPR and desperately searched for any vital signs as they rushed him to a hospital. But Jamie Coots had finally gone too far. He was dead a little over an hour after the snake had bitten him on the back of the hand. And if you're thinking that the madness would finally end, well, not quite. The church is still very much alive, and they have more snakes on stage than ever, as well as the one that killed Coots. The pastors, including Coots' own son, Cody, took up the reins. But there's at least some good news here. The new generation of preachers are more than willing to seek medical help when they get bitten, and there's sure no shortage of snake bites at the church. You can count on at least a dozen trips to the emergency room every year. They don't allow anyone but themselves to handle the serpents anymore. They've stated that they take full responsibility for their snakes, and that they also take the safety of their congregation to heart, just like any good shepherd would. But some say that despite these new safety precautions, it's only a matter of time before more people like Jamie Coots and Melinda Brown meet their terrifying final affliction. As symbols of death and the devil, snakes have always been a particularly divisive animal and tend to have a drastically different effect on different people. Some hate them and squirm at the idea of being anywhere near one, whereas others love them so much that they want to keep them in their homes. It is estimated that over 160,000 snakes are currently kept as pets in Canadian homes, and with few regulations about the breeding of these animals, there can be issues regarding their behavior, which can result in tragedy. Regardless of personal opinion about the animal, it is generally agreed that snakes, especially very large ones, should be correctly enclosed and kept away from children. Unfortunately, this was not the case when Noah and Connor Barth entered the home of a family friend who owned an exotic pet store, a home that they would never leave. When 6-year-old Connor and his 4-year-old brother Noah were invited to a sleepover next door at a friend's house to see the animals that were held in the home, they were very excited. Even at this young age, they were already very interested in animals, and the idea of being able to get closer to them than any zoo would ever allow made the invite even more enticing. The friend's father was Jean-Claude Savoie, and he owned the local exotic pet store. He loved being able to show off his collection to children, believing that the interest might stick and lead to a lifelong hobby. The boys regularly spent the night over at his house, as his son was close friends with the boy, and so Jean-Claude was seen as an extension of the family. He cared for the boys very much and considered them to be his other sons, so he would always make sure they were happy and well taken care of. They spent their day playing in the garden, interacting with goats, rabbits, cats, and dogs. They held the snakes and played in the empty tanks. To end the day, Jean-Claude took them out in his tractor, even letting them steer it, which they were delighted by. When they were finished, they cleaned themselves up and headed to bed around midnight. The brothers were set up in the living room on the sofa, while Jean-Claude and his son slept in their rooms. The boys were excited to be sleeping at their friend's house, and the idea that tomorrow they would be playing with even more animals made them barely able to sleep. Sadly, the boys would never wake again. Unbeknownst to anyone in the apartment, one of the exotic animals was planning an escape that night. In the room adjacent to where the young boys were sleeping, there was a 100-pound, 14-foot African rock python with an open vent above it. The species was illegal in Canada unless the owner had a specific license, which Jean-Claude did not have. But the man believed that it was a welcome addition to his collection, which he enjoyed showing off to people. The snake was not friendly, and at times was particularly aggressive towards humans, as it was a timid animal and would attack when scared. The animal had already attempted to escape earlier in the week through the vent, but it had gotten stuck, leading Jean-Claude to believe that the snake was too big to ever escape through the hole, and so it wouldn't need to be covered up or fixed. This was a decision that would cause the disastrous results of that night. The snake was hungry. It hadn't been fed in the last 24 hours, and so it was forced to try to find its own food. In its malnourished state, it was much smaller, which meant that it was now able to fit into the vent, and found its way into the ventilation shaft. It slowly slithered through the shaft, moving from room to room as it tried to figure out where it could get its next meal. Although it was slim enough to fit through the shaft, its 100-pound weight began to take a toll on the ventilation shaft, and when it was making its way over the living room, it fell. Pythons will naturally constrict if they are in danger, and so, when the snake finally fell onto something, it grasped it tightly and continued to constrict. There was a smell of farm animals that filled the room, and so the snake concluded that the thing it had grabbed onto was a prey animal. Unfortunately, the snake was incorrect, and it had in fact fallen on top of the sleeping brothers. The smell was coming from them, as they had been playing on the farm all day, but the snake was not able to differentiate this. It could smell prey, and so it would treat the boys as it would any other prey. The boys initially tried to struggle, but were immediately overpowered. The snake was made of pure muscle, and the boys were no match for such prehistoric power. It began to constrict more, wrapping itself around the necks of the boys and biting mercilessly at the children's faces. As the children stopped struggling, the snake continued to bite and squeeze the children, either in an attempt to stabilize itself after the fall, or because it was attempting to eat its prey. It is thought that the boys passed away quite quickly, as the snake squeezed harder and gradually suffocated them. Although it would have been initially painful and terrifying for the children, we can only hope that it was over quickly and as painlessly as possible. Despite the speed of the attack, the snake did not try to consume the children and instead left them where it had killed them, their lifeless bodies giving the impression that they were peacefully sleeping. Jean-Claude woke up early and came into the living room at 6:30 a.m. He saw the children on the floor, and in the dim light, he could see their sleeping faces, and so continued into the kitchen quietly so that he wouldn't wake them. He accidentally made some noise in the kitchen and peeked out to check on the boys, expecting the sound to have woken them up, but they hadn't moved. This was unusual, and Jean-Claude started to have a bad feeling about the entire situation. He flicked on the lights to double-check when he saw the collapsed ceiling and debris across the floor. The boys still hadn't moved, so he initially worried that the debris had hurt the children, but then he saw his snake waiting in the corner. He looked at the animal and then at the boys and realized what had happened. The boys were blue. His snake had killed them. He ran out of the room to the boys' mother's house, banging on her door and shouting for her. "Oh my God, your kids are dead." Mandy heard the words echo through her hallway and her heart stopped. Her boyfriend ran from the house to check next door, and when he returned, his face was white. "It's true. It's a f***ing nightmare, but it's true." Mandy's world ended with those words. The tragedy hit the news worldwide, and thousands of people sent prayers to the family of the two young boys who were killed in such an unfortunate and graphic way. The snake was taken from the scene and euthanized by a vet who commented on how aggressive the animal was. Mandy began legal proceedings against Jean-Claude for criminal negligence, causing death to avenge her children, but she knew that nothing would ever be good enough. She would never get her children back. During the case, they found that Jean-Claude had been warned by other reptile owners that he needed to cover the vent as soon as possible, as the snake would be able to escape. But he took his time to get it fixed, thinking that the animal was too large to fit through. What he didn't take into account is the amount that snakes can contract their muscles, especially when they haven't been fed. To convict the snake owner for criminal negligence, the court needed to answer 3 questions. 1. Did he fail in his duty as an adult to protect the children? 2. Did he show reckless disregard for their safety? 3. Did he fail to take appropriate measures to protect the children, causing their death? Ultimately, after 3 years of court proceedings, Jean-Claude Savoie was found not guilty and the case was dropped against him. Although their mother was disappointed with the result, it didn't matter to her. She would still have to continue life without her children, who at the hands of her friend met their terrifying final affliction. Eugene de Leon wasn't your average 60-year-old. Eugene was a snake wrangler. He made it his life's mission to educate people of the dangers and the beauty of these magnificent animals. Even though his love for the creatures that have inspired fear in humans since the beginning of time was a showstopper at events, Eugene was no showman for the fame of it. He genuinely believed and fought for conservation, and he did everything he could to teach people how to respect them. In his off time, Eugene answered calls to remove snakes from homes and buildings, and he was a volunteer firefighter. Everyone who knew him said that they could always count on a smile and a library's worth of knowledge about the world of reptiles. Eugene loved snakes most of all, but his knowledge around all things reptilian did not end with snakes. Turtles, lizards, crocodiles. If it had scales, then Eugene was the man to go to. He specialized in rattlesnakes and traveled the country to showcase his vast collection. Eugene was a familiar face at almost every convention and festival that needed a snake handler. The Rattlesnake Roundup Festival event takes place every year in May. Rattlesnake roundups, or rattlesnake rodeos as they are sometimes known as, is a very popular pastime in the southern states of the USA. Texas especially is known for them. Though the festivals are centered around rattlesnakes, they certainly aren't the only reptiles out for display. Here they host classes on how to handle snakes, anti-venom production, snakeskin leather, food products, and culinary classes around cooking with snake meat. You name it, you can find it here. Back in the old days, this was a deplorable sideshow event that didn't have a great track record of treating its animals very well or putting in a whole lot of effort into safety standards. But since the 90s, strict laws around safety and animal care turned the snake rodeos into an excellent platform to teach the public about conservation efforts, and that even though these are incredibly dangerous animals, much more can be gained from respecting and protecting them than simply eradicating them off the face of the earth. It's not the kind of event that everyone will enjoy, given that there's plenty of live butchering going on. But for the most part, the Rattlesnake Roundup aims to educate more than anything else. Eugene was attending the festival for the 6th year in a row, that year in 2022, and he and his prized rattlers were one of the star attractions. The first day went as you'd expect. Hundreds of people stopped by Eugene's stall to watch him handle the live reptiles and listen to his lectures about safety precautions and descriptions of the species' behavior and habitat. The second day, Saturday, was even busier than the first. By the afternoon, those who had to wait to get off work finally arrived, and thousands of people had already visited and participated in most of the festivities. The constant trampling of feet, the strange smells, and the unending drone of voices and shouts from the scores of people milling around was starting to get on one rattler's nerves. After being hauled out of the dark and warm box multiple times that day, you almost couldn't blame it for having enough of being disturbed. Eugene used his handling stick to lift a particularly large specimen out of the box, and the crowd oohed and awed their appreciation as he lifted it high above his head. The 8-foot-long creature reacted to the bright lights and the dizzying amount of movement around it in a very predictable way. It lashed out. Like lightning, it struck Eugene from above, landing 2 strikes in quick succession on his shoulder. The attack was so swift and underwhelming that most of the spectators missed it completely, and the few who did catch it were immediately put at ease by Eugene's calm demeanor. He simply smiled, placed the snake back in its box, and motioned for his son, who was also an expert handler, to take over the display. Eugene walked to the medic station, and in that short walk he already started feeling the effects of the venom. His shoulder burned like fire, and the pain was spreading down his arm and across his chest. Eugene knew better than anyone that being bitten on the upper body was a death sentence. There are just more blood vessels and major arteries to transport the deadly venom across the body, and once it reaches the lungs and the brain, well, your chances of survival drop significantly. When he reached the station, Eugene collapsed before he could even get a word out. Through blurred vision and his labored breathing, he could only point to his shoulder, indicating where he was bitten. Ironically, the biggest festival around rattlesnakes doesn't keep any antivenom on the premises. It's a heavily controlled substance that can only be administered at a hospital. And to make matters worse, rattlesnake antivenom can't be stored in the long term. It has to be prepared only when a patient who needs it comes in. The preparation takes hours, and the biggest struggle is keeping the victims alive until the preparation can be completed. Eugene knew, even before the helicopter arrived, that he wasn't going to make it. A bite that high on the body, and at his age, well, his chances of surviving were next to none. And sure enough, Eugene lost consciousness just as the aircraft lifted off the ground. Paramedics notified the hospital of the case, and they rushed to get the process of preparing the antivenom started. But 8 hours after being bitten, Eugene breathed his last. He never woke up after he passed out on the festival grounds. His death caused an uproar. Rattlesnake rodeos were once again in the headlines, and people were questioning the festival's safety standards. But honestly, Eugene did everything by the book, exactly like he should have. This truly was just a tragic and unfortunate accident. His family has come out with statements that he died doing what he was passionate about, and that they would continue his legacy of education and awareness for as long as they live. Every event, festival, and conference that Eugene ever showed his beloved scaly companions at reached out to fund his funeral. And a fair amount of citizens who he'd helped during his firefighting days also chipped in. It became very clear just how many people Eugene de Leon reached during his lifetime. His passion drove him, but sadly, at the end of the day, it was also that passion that led to his terrifying final affliction. In June 2018, a stealthy predator was on the prowl in Indonesia. 54-year-old Wah Tiba lived on Muna Island just off Sulawesi's south coast. The small island is beautiful and isolated. It covers an area of just over 650 square miles. It's surrounded by turquoise blue waters and a fringe of golden sandy beaches. Dotted about the island are freshwater lagoons hidden by dense jungle and waterfalls emerging from the greenery. Most of the locals on the island make a living from agriculture. They grow rice, sago palms, and tubers. Some fish in the sea, often catching the much sought-after and highly profitable sea cucumbers, as well as the plentiful fish. Communities on the island are close-knit. Everyone knows everyone else. Wah Tiba grew vegetables to feed her family and to sell at the local market. She had been having problems recently with wild boars. They had been coming out at night and feasting on the produce grown in the nearby gardens. They were destroying Wah Tiba's hard work, food, and supplementary income. One night, she decided she had had enough. She wanted to stop the wild boars from eating all her vegetables and needed to scare them away. The rainy season had recently ended. The surrounding countryside was lush and green. The air was hot and humid as Wah Tiba stepped out of her house that evening. The temperature was a pleasant 20 degrees Celsius, a significant drop from the low 30s in the daytime sun. She grabbed a flashlight and machete from her house and slipped her feet into her sandals. The garden was about half a mile away from her village. all was quiet in the night except for the chatter of a few people as they made their way home for the day. Watiba walked out of the village and down the track towards the garden. Either side of her was thick undergrowth and rocky outcrops. The path meandered through the trees. Soon the trees gave way to a rocky area. The garden lay at the base of a large cliff, which also had caves in the rock face. It was a known spot for snakes. When she arrived there, she spotted the wild boar. They were snuffling around on the freshly planted vegetable patch, rooting in the earth and munching their way through the feast. They were making a mess and destroying Watiba's hard work. Watiba shouted at them and clapped her hands loudly. They squealed and scarpered, running away into the forest. She walked up to her vegetable patch to see what damage they had done. She shone her flashlight up and down the garden. She was going to have to come up with a new way of deterring them. That evening, Watiba wasn't the only one looking for the wild boar. In the undergrowth, a predator had picked up the wild boar's scent and was making its way to the garden. When the pigs ran away, the predator turned its attention to Watiba. As she bent over to inspect her vegetables, the ambushed predator struck. It was an enormous reticulated python, 23 feet or 7 meters long. It lunged at Watiba. Its mouth opened wide as it bit her on her back. It knocked her forwards, and she felt the pain from the bite. She jumped up and looked around. The machete flew from her hand and fell on the ground. In an instant, the python had her in its grip. It coiled its body around Watiba. She could feel its constriction, its immense muscles squeezing her body. She couldn't move. Her arms were locked down by her side. Her legs were wrapped in the snake's powerful embrace. Watiba tried to struggle. She tried to fight it, but the more she wriggled, the tighter it became. She struggled to breathe. Her blood vessels were squashed and squeezed. Her rib cage could expand no more. Through its rapid attack, the snake had secured its victim. In a matter of minutes, Watiba lost consciousness. She could no longer breathe, and the life had been squeezed out of her. Tragically, Watiba died on her own that night. She was a much-loved member of the family and the local community. She was a devoted mother of 2 and would be sorely missed. For her, the attack must have been truly terrifying. It must have been an incredibly painful way to go, a feeling of helplessness and powerlessness without the ability to fight back. She had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The snake had been hunting her that night. It was likely attracted to the area because of the wild boar. The forests of Sulawesi have been in sharp decline recently due to deforestation for logging and to make way for agriculture. This leaves the native wildlife with nowhere to go. Predators like the python are more likely to come across people. They must cross open farmland to travel from one section of forest to the next. Their fragmented habitat is making hunting their usual prey more and more difficult. As agriculture expands across Sulawesi, pythons are attracted by other animals that live near people and their farmland. Rodents and livestock are easy prey for these snakes. So too, it seems, are humans. When Watiba struggled no more, the snake was able to consume her. In a chilling moment, the snake moved toward Watiba's head. It opened its mouth wide. The stretchy ligaments in its jaws enabled it to eat prey much larger than itself. Then it engulfed Watiba. It inched its mouth over Watiba's head and down along her body. Slowly, she was swallowed down into the snake's belly. Her feet lay near its mouth, her head toward its tail. When her family noticed that she hadn't returned home the following morning, they alerted the village. Immediately, people began searching for her. More than 100 people joined in the search. They retraced her footsteps and made their way to the garden. They could see that Watiba had been there. On the ground were her flashlight and sandals, but Watiba was nowhere to be seen. She had vanished. Just then there was a cry from one of the villagers. Little more than 50 meters away, there was a huge 14-foot reticulated python. It was having difficulty moving as it was incredibly bloated. The search party suspected the worst. They immediately killed the snake by severing its head, and several of them lifted it up and carried it back to the village. When they arrived, they lay it on the floor. The crowd gathered around. Some had mobile phones and were recording the scene as another took out a sharp knife. He ran the knife down the length of the snake's body, slitting it open in one go. To their shock and horror, the villagers could see a body inside the bulging snake. As they peeled the snake's body apart, they could see that it was Watiba inside. She was completely intact. She was still wearing all her clothes. Some of the onlookers screamed. Others cried. It was a traumatic discovery for those who knew her. The community was shaken. They feared leaving their homes alone or going out at night. With agricultural land spreading further and further into the surrounding jungle, reports like this are becoming more common. The snakes can grow to massive lengths, and although humans aren't their natural prey, they are opportunistic ambush predators. Watiba was given a proper burial later that very same day. This was in keeping with their religious beliefs. It was quickly organized amongst her family and friends. Her 2 children had to say goodbye to their mother. When she had left her family home the evening before, no one could have predicted that would be her final farewell. It seems, although rare, attacks from pythons are becoming more common in Indonesia. Only the year before, a 25-year-old was attacked, killed, and eaten by a reticulated python on mainland Sulawesi. He had been working in one of the many palm oil plantations. Also, a year before, another man was attacked whilst working in the palm oil plantation on Sumatra. This particular person survived the attack, but the 7.8-meter snake had caused him serious injuries. As their habitat is destroyed and human settlements expand, interactions between humans and large snakes are going to happen more often. These are unlikely to be the last we hear about such tragic and terrifying deaths. With the sharp rise of snake attacks, locals are beginning to live in fear of meeting their untimely final affliction. There are 10 different species of rattlesnakes in Texas, all of which are venomous enough to kill someone unfortunate enough to come across one. Their venom causes the blood of the victim to thin to a dangerous level, damaging blood vessels and preventing clotting, causing death by internal bleeding. These kinds of bites need to be treated very quickly, or else the victim will die a horribly painful death. And, with antivenom hard to find, sometimes not even a hospital can save you if you are bitten by one of these creatures. Those living in Texas need to keep a special eye out for the western diamondback rattlesnake, as it is the most common rattler in the state, responsible for the majority of the attacks on humans. With its vicious behavior and powerful venom, it is definitely an animal that most would want to avoid. 40-year-old Jeremy Sutcliffe lived a simple life, building a home for his wife and keeping her as safe as he could. They had recently moved to their dream house, and while his wife Jennifer worked as a nurse, he was in the process of fixing the house into their perfect haven. In May of 2018, the weather was hot as usual in Texas, and the couple decided that they would work in the garden together, as they often would on the weekends. Jennifer worked away from home and cherished all the time they could spend together at their home. They had planned on hosting a cookout in the evening for their daughter and her friends, and wanted everything to be perfect. Suddenly, Jennifer screamed as she had tried to pull at a weed. A huge western diamondback rattlesnake rose from the ground and threatened to strike her. She slowly backed away, screaming at Jeremy to help her. Thinking his wife had just seen a small garden snake, which were common and venomless, he nonchalantly walked over. Before he saw the truth, his wife was face to face with a huge venomous snake. His mind was racing as he realized that he was the only one that could save her, so he grabbed a shovel to defend his wife. He tried to pick the snake up by the tail in hopes he wouldn't have to kill it, but its hissing and lunges made it impossible. In fear of his wife and being bitten himself, He was left with no choice. He needed to kill the snake. With one smooth movement, he brought the shovel down onto the snake's body, severing its head from its body in one strike. He felt odd about seeing the snake still twisting around while separated from its head, but felt relief that the attack was over. With his wife now safe, they went inside to comfort each other after the harrowing event. 10 minutes later, Jennifer wanted to let her two small dogs outside to pee, but knew that it would be dangerous to let them interact with the venomous dead snake. She asked her husband Jeremy if he could move it out of their reach, and he agreed. As he walks over to the garden, he notices the snake had stopped squirming around and appeared to be dead. He picked up the longer half of the snake by the tail and dropped it into a grocery bag. But as he picked up the snake's head, it suddenly struck him, sinking its teeth deep into his hand and emptying all of its venom straight into his bloodstream. His hand was immediately flooded with intense pain as he started screaming for his wife, hoping that she would be able to help him. He could see the snake's body in the bag and could see that it was definitely dead, so how had it bitten him? This was a question that he could figure out later. Right now, he needed to get the snake off of him and go straight to the hospital. He desperately tried to pry the dead animal from his hand, but it was latched on tight with little room to move. He squeezed his other hand in between his skin and the snake's mouth, hoping it would let go. But that's when the second attack happened. As he managed to loosen the snake's grip, it suddenly bit down onto his finger, unleashing the last of his venom into Jeremy's system. He finally managed to tug the animal from his hand and flung it as far away as he could before it could attack again. He screamed out in agony. His vision was now going blurry from the venom coursing through his bloodstream, and he was sure that he would die. But his wife Jennifer had other ideas. She ran to the car and ordered Jeremy to get in, knowing that they only had a short amount of time to get him to the hospital, or else the venom would surely kill him. Jennifer was already on the phone to 911 as she drove, explaining what had happened and that they needed help. The hospital was 30 minutes away, and Jennifer knew that the hospital might not have the correct anti-venom that would save her husband. The 911 operators were directing her to the nearest ambulance so that they could take him to the hospital as quickly as possible. Jeremy was fading in and out of consciousness and terrified. He couldn't see anything anymore and struggled to breathe. Suddenly, halfway to the hospital, Jeremy had a seizure. Still on the phone with 911, Jennifer received instructions over the phone to help him while still racing down the road. She pulled over beside a church in order to administer CPR to her husband. Finally, after a grueling 15 minutes, the ambulance and the crew arrived and quickly transported him into their vehicle before speeding off towards the hospital with the sirens blaring. After 10 minutes, the ambulance suddenly stopped, and Jennifer feared the worst, that her husband must have succumbed to his injuries. But Jeremy wasn't dead, not yet. Instead, they informed her a helicopter had been called to pick him up. His body was failing fast, and they didn't have the equipment to keep him alive. The helicopter arrived almost instantaneously and took Jeremy to the hospital, where the staff were waiting to save his life. Even though he was at the hospital, he wasn't out of the woods yet. His blood pressure was dangerously low, and his organs were quickly failing. The nurses had to work harder than they thought possible to keep him alive. Usually, when someone is bitten by a snake, they will be given 2 or 3 doses of antivenom. But Jeremy's condition was so bad that he was given a staggering 26 doses. Eventually, it was decided that Jeremy would need to be placed into an induced coma and put on a ventilator. Jennifer was horrified and felt that her husband would soon die, as his injuries increased in severity with each passing minute. They really didn't think that he would make it through the night, and Jennifer stayed by his side the entire time, watching his blood pressure and praying for it to increase. Luckily for her, after a heart-wrenching night, Jeremy's blood pressure finally began to improve the next evening until he was finally able to be woken from his coma. They were thankful, but he still had a long way to go until he would be healthy again. Despite the fact Jeremy survived the attack, The snake venom still had a devastating effect on his body, nearly destroying his kidneys and leaving him with lifelong problems like gallstones and extreme abdominal pain. When he first woke up, he had no idea where he was. All he could feel was the pain from his ordeal, but he was thankful to be surrounded by his family. As the snake had injected him in his fingers, the skin and nerves were severely damaged, and despite many skin graft attempts, 2 of them had to be amputated. Jeremy didn't seem to mind. He was just grateful to still be alive and be surrounded by his family during such a dark time in his life. After lots of surgeries and a very near-death experience, Jeremy Sutcliffe was released back home after a month of hospitalization. The family even threw a party to celebrate his recovery, and most importantly, the fact that he was still alive after such a harrowing experience. If a mammal loses its head, it will die almost immediately. But snakes and other ectotherms, which don't need as much oxygen to fuel the brain, can probably live on for minutes or even hours. Chickens have been known to live months without a head. In particular, the case of Mike the Headless chicken lived for 18 months without a head. Snakes have been known to live for hours without heads, depending upon the species. A famous case in China was when a chef preparing a rare delicacy known as cobra soup was fatally bitten by the decapitated head of one of the snakes he had chopped up for the unusual soup. Now, after battling insane pain and losing 2 of his fingers in the attack, Jeremy knows to leave a dead snake alone, or else it might just get the final bite. He will never forget the day that a dead snake sought its last revenge and nearly brought him to his final affliction.